welcome to a very special episode of Nineworks TV and the podcast Nineworks Radio. First of all, though, there's a couple of people I'd like to thank for making today happen, particularly like with such short notice. So we're here in the lovely environment at Tower Bridge Studios, podcast and film editing and recording facility. Check out the Tower Bridge Studios website. It really is a fantastic facility that makes people like us look very good, possibly even better than we actually are. When it comes to presenting. So thanks to Tower Bridge Studios. I'd also like to say thank you to Ashgood Porsche again for supplying the Guards Red 964 C2 in the background. It is for sale. Have a look at the Ashgood's website. I'd like to also thank Guy for picking the car up last minute and running around here. So thank you, and thanks for joining us today, Guy, as well. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to the stars of today's show. We've got Cheryl and Ben Dimson.
Hello, hi.
Ben, you and I spoke via Zoom during the height of the pandemic, which seems like a long time ago, but it was only 3 years, so...
Right in the middle of COVID.
It really was, and it was a very patchy Zoom recording link, so I think we're slightly doing better today, I guess. But also Cheryl as well, like, it's a real pleasure to meet you in person and chat to you for the first time as well.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having us.
Excellent, absolutely our pleasure, as I said. So, I mean, yeah, I guess like to highlight your careers at Porsche, it was early 80s to early 90s for both of you, give or take?
I was there, started in 82 to 92, exactly. And
They're 81 to 88, maybe?
And in your previous video, you explained to me like your journey to Porsche, from Manila to the automotive college in California, and then Ford, Volkswagen, and then Porsche, I believe. Is that correct?
No, it was actually after graduating from the Art Center College of Design. I had 3 job offers, Volkswagen and Ford initially, and then Porsches came. And that for me was, wow, you know, it was an incredible moment. I go, oh my gosh, you know, how can I turn Porsche down? You know, it had to be my choice. So packed a couple of bags. A year after receiving that invitation to join Porsche, and then took the Lufthansa flight to Germany, to Stuttgart.
I remember you saying one of your first memories of getting off the plane in Germany is you picked up by a Porsche employee straight on the Autobahn.
Right.
Doing some ungodly speed. I think it's the fastest you'd ever been in a car at the time.
In a car, yes. And that was no ordinary Porsche employee. That was Dr. Rabe, who is related to the original Dr. Rabe that was part of the Porsche family from the beginning.
Yes.
And he was head of the personnel department. And he picked me up in a 924 Turbo. And between the Stuttgart airport and Weissach, we were cruising the Autobahn at 200 and, oh my, it was like well beyond 130 miles an hour, which is the fastest I've ever been in a car. And we were probably at almost 150 or 150 plus or something. And, you know, all you could see was this blur of trees in the forest going by. And we were having a conversation about my flight, my family,
Yeah.
you know, and he was trying to explain to me what Weissach was going to be like. And so, wow. And before I knew it, there we were taking the exit with the Ausfahrt to Weissach. You know?
Yeah.
And wow.
Little did you know at the time, I guess, that you'd be designing the car's successor in the 944 Turbo, just...
Yes, yeah. One of the first projects I worked on in the exterior studio was the 928 was the first project that I worked on. So the 928 S4, that development eventually led to, you know, the design language that we used on the 944 Turbo, and then the 959, and then eventually on to the 964. So the 964 was probably the last project I worked on at Porsche.
Yeah. There's so much to unpick here as we'll do so over the coming hour, really. But Cheryl, I want to jump to you first of all, if that's okay. So are you like California native?
I am a California native.
Amazing. Okay, so I'm interested to learn about your journey like to Porsche at the start of the 80s.
Well, I was also a graduate of Art Center, so, and actually it was the day I graduated. He was my boyfriend at the time. And we, only talked very briefly because it was expensive in those days. Controversy. So anyway, he told me that they were looking for a graphic designer. And so that was the first application I put in right out of school. I mean, it was, handwritten letters and slides. I mean, like literally little 35 millimeter slides put together in a package. And that's how we would send the whole package over to Europe. And yeah, I mailed it off. And then I took a job in San Francisco, worked at Landor and Associates. And while I was there, the offer was made to go to Porsche. So it was like the right day on the right, the right desk on the right day. And I was offered the job, and so how could I refuse?
Wow.
And so I too packed up my bags and took 2 suitcases and flew off on World Airways funked World Airways to Germany. And from there I stayed there for almost 10 years. It's a great time.
High-speed pickup as well or not?
No, I can tell you about a very slow, rusty.
It was the opposite.
Pick me up.
That's incredible.
Back in those days, we weren't even allowed to drive the Porsches yet. No, but we weren't even allowed to have calling cards as designers and employees. I guess they were trying to keep it as quiet as possible. No?
Yeah. So difficult to do that in this day and age with like tech, isn't it?
It's very different.
As first jobs in automotive go, Cheryl, that's absolutely outrageous, to be fair, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it was. I mean, it was the vision of Tony Lapine is that he wanted to have somebody that did graphics in the styling department so that it could be part of the whole package.
Yeah.
So, anything that was surface graphics or anything like that, that was my duty. And we built a department around it, and then I led the little department. So
Excellent. So that's inside and outside the car?
it's inside and outside the car, and also where the car is shown. So that's, again, we would work on wherever the car was being presented by the company. So we're responsible for trade shows and internationally, and the racing, where racing cars were being presented, and yeah.
Would that have been liveries as well?
Pardon?
Like racing liveries? Obviously Porsche's very famous for some amazing liveries. Rothmans.
Yeah, I have a Rothman story too. So yeah, actually Rothman's, the design had already been done, but I was asked at the beginning I was asked to tweak things for one of the Rothmans Group C cars. Group C cars.
Group C.
And anyway, so I felt my typography background that the shell above the headlamp should be a little smaller so that there was a nicer frame around it. This big typography thing. Anyway, Shell didn't think that same thing, so I really got my hand slapped about that because they had paid a big amount of money and they noticed that it had been tweaked a little bit, and they're like, no. It's like, oh, okay, I'll leave that one alone. But yeah, after that, we were involved in a lot of race cars.
So between Ben, your work in terms of how a car looks and that side of styling, and then Cheryl, as you were saying, with what you've covered in your career in terms of even how these Porsches are presented at the time, you've got so much ticked off between you, like a proper Porsche power couple here,
Yeah, we were.
Yeah. I don't know. I think we were just at the right place at the right time. However cliche that sounds, it pretty much worked that way. Got to remember, back then there was no internet. Everything was snail mail, and everything took time. So I guess that had an effect too on how Tony Lapine would respond. He probably knew that at some point he had to make a decision on who he brought in, and having had previous experiences with Richard Soderbergh, one of his chief designers, who was also an Art Center graduate. I'm sure Dick probably influenced Tony Lapine at the time to go shopping for designers, you know, not just in England, but also in America. Because the only two schools at the time that were catering intensively to the car industry was the Royal College of Art here in London and the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, those were his choices.
Yeah.
And then having to do everything through mail, so it took a lot of time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's only kind of 10 years really after like the Porsche family had relinquished their roles on the boards.
Right.
There was a lot of kind of behind the scenes change at the company, I guess. It'd be great for everybody at home to kind of get an understanding of what it was like working at Porsche in the 80s. Very different company to today, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, just the communications was a challenge in itself. You know, obviously you had to learn German, but as designers, you know, you can kind of communicate not just with your hands and hand signals, but you can literally draw something to get your point across, you know, and sometimes you really had to do that. You had to rely on that. But living in Germany, you know, there's no way around having to learn the language. So a lot of the engineers spoke English, but not everybody spoke English. But, you know, it worked both sides. They struggled to explain things in German, and, you know, there was a lot of head scratching, but, you know, we were able to communicate through the drawings and, you know, the language of the car.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
And the studio at that time, a lot happened in English because, like you mentioned, RCA and Art Center, and those were kind of the feeders for all the designers. So they all had that background. Even if they were German, they spoke English very, very well. But once you walked outside those doors and hit the engineering department, it was a sink or swim thing. And yeah, and when you got sent off to meetings, and you know, I think Tony tended to believe in us. He like really did believe in us. I remember him sending me off to Zuffenhausen to meetings like on my own, and it's like I'd been there for, I don't know, maybe like a year or two, and it's like okay, like how am I supposed to? But it's interesting. There's still some technical terms I kind of know in German, and they have to think about what is it in English because you have to learn it real quick on the fly.
You know how German words are super long. You know, everything is.
It makes a lot of sense once you figure it all out.
And Cheryl, did you struggle like as a woman, you know, in the 80s? I mean, obviously things now, there's a lot of equality and diversity and so on, but in the 80s, I mean, was that a challenge as well?
It was. I was always very accepted, and everyone accepted me. So it's like, but you know, there's always things that are definitely, you know, I remember one time actually when my boss at the time, Ginger Ostel, asked me, he goes, "Well, can you drive?" And it's like, what? It's like, how could you even ask me that? But I realized that he picked me up at the airport. He was always the one driving. So it's like, oh, okay, yeah, okay, give me a car and let's go drive. And so, so there was definitely things.
And you had to drive a stick.
Yeah, well, I had to.
That was another thing.
But I could do that. so
It surprised him.
And that's what I was also just mentioning too, is like, sometimes they would come to me and they, well, what would a woman want? Like, what would a woman want in a Porsche? And I was always very big on telling them, a woman doesn't want a pink car. She doesn't want anything special. She wants to be able to show herself that she can do this. And I mean, but at the same time, I did make a whole series of pink Porsches for a trade show. So they were very powder pink, and they were, it's the 80s. It was like, okay, we made powder pink and powder blue, and they were really cool. So.
Yeah. Even in the modern day, it's a real kind of failing of the automotive industry that there aren't more, there's not more female talent in prominent positions. I think Porsche is at board level addressing that latterly, which is commendable, but like, I don't think enough people know that like amazing talents of like yourself, Cheryl, you know, Vlaster as well, that have contributed significantly to Porsche history, you know?
Right. Yeah. No, definitely. We were always lumped in one we got all put in one place. And we were interchangeable. Like we had a woman that was hired to just do fabrics, and she actually had a loom and would weave fabrics in the studios. And I don't know, for some reason, somewhere, Tony, there was somebody came in to do an interview, and they go, Cheryl, you sit there. I go, I don't know anything about weaving. And I was like, what am I doing here? It's like basically I was a fill-in woman, you know. It's
Right,
like,
right,
okay.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
like,
Wow, wow.
But it's like, oh well, whatever. I think that's another thing too. It's a different time, different attitudes, and I accepted it. I mean, I knew what I was getting into, a very male-dominated field, and I could play with the big boys, so I was okay. I could ski better than a lot of them, so
Right, yeah.
not necessarily drive better than them.
As an extension of the question, like, what was it like to work at Porsche? You guys obviously met like Ferry Porsche. So what was it like interacting like with the Porsche family at the time? You know, Ferry Porsche. You know, what was he like?
Well, whenever he came, it was a big to-do. You know, everything was prepped.
Okay.
He was like, you know, he was the feudal lord coming to visit his kingdom of cars. But when he actually got there, he was so approachable. He was very humble and very personal. You know, he would ask you how you're doing, in German, of course. And he would ask you about, you know, of course, some of the bosses would always try to interrupt and say, this is this and that. And then he would tell them to just, I want to ask him something. And he would do things like that. And it was terrific.
Yeah, awesome.
And that's when I mentioned about redoing the crest. I mean, that's the family lore. So it's like I was touching kind of the sacred crest, and there was no chain of command on approval of that. It was me, Lapine, and Ferdinand, the three of us talked about it.
That's
and then that was it.
Wow.
He gave the nod, and
Yeah.
that was it, you know, so it was.
Wow,
And
yeah.
he's, like he said, he was so humble and so very genuine, yeah.
Yeah, I'm keen to dive into that in a bit more detail, Cheryl. So, like, did you feel the responsibility of designing or redesigning, I guess, and tweaking that Porsche crest, which meant so much to the family?
Well, yeah, of course I did. But I also felt a big responsibility to make a consistency in their typographic statement. I mean, obviously, the elongated Porsche logotype was already existed when I came, but it hadn't been translated into the crest, and I very strongly felt like it needed to be corrected, and so while I was doing that, I felt like the horse needed a little tweaking, and I took out a couple lines, and yeah. But I didn't want to touch too much else. I mean, and if you really go back and look at, you know, where all the parts derived from, like the antlers from the region that the Stuttgart's in, is like, I believe that's Baden-Württemberg was the crest or those antlers.
Yeah.
And you know, I didn't want to tweak them too much that it wasn't
Recognizable,
their
Yes.
you know, their heritage. I was definitely respectful of that.
It's interesting, Kings, when I spoke to Ben previously, you mentioned with car design, Ben, how, you know, there's an art to tweaking some bits, but not tweaking everything or going too far. And it kind of sounds like there's a synergy with the crest there as well, you know?
I think with everything, it's definitely Porsche's evolutionary. It's not, try not to, you know, try to make it very logical.
What year did your redesign of the crest appear on the front of cars, Cheryl? Was this sort of like at the start of the Carrera 3.2, so 84?
Yeah,
Or slightly
I'm
before?
not really sure if it,
Well, with the 944 Turbo was the first one that came out.
Okay.
That definitely had the
New crest.
The new crest, yeah.
Yeah.
and I think it got developed, and like kind of when everything got, I'm not sure it changed with a model. It might have just changed,
Yeah.
like now this is the new part number.
Okay,
you know?
yeah.
So it's like, yeah, I'm not really
Yeah, although when the 911 SC in the earlier 80s was redone, then they changed the Carrera script. Remember that?
Yeah, the Carrera
The
script.
Carrera
No,
script they
the Carrera
changed.
script was
yeah.
before the crest.
Right, but then the
The
crest
crest was after.
was
yeah.
when the
Yeah,
first.
after.
Yeah.
It was
I
definitely
think it was
after.
9944 turbo.
Nerds like Guy and I now are going to be going up to every like
Yeah,
1970s and 80s
Yes.
Porsche.
Yeah.
And you could tell me.
Spotting the subtle
I really
differences.
don't know. I mean, I know definitely when I did it. I mean, I remember doing it and doing the drawings. I mean, because also we would do the drawings and then they went into engineering and they were engineered. And then the parts were made and the crests are made, you know, at somebody's little business somewhere in Baden-Württemberg.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where it is. I went there. But, you know, it's a guy that's been making, I mean, it's a family-owned business that's been making that part
Yeah,
forever.
it's been connected to Porsche
Yeah.
from ever
So-
since. Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah,
it's, and you know, and so they were carved out. I mean, you know, there was a model made of them and stuff. So it's
Yeah.
but yeah, you guys can figure that out.
I'll
It's
have
our
to look
challenge.
at, have to look at James's car. So on the Heritage latest cars, they've put a Heritage crest on them, haven't they?
Yeah, yes, just from the long bonnet.
I was going to say, it's got what goes that far back.
But I don't. Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not real sure it changed with the model. It might have just changed with the.
Yeah, we're working out. We've been given some homework
Yeah,
Guy,
there you
already
go.
on this. So,
Exactly.
like, moving on with like further details. So, if I'm correct in saying this, if you own, like, say, a 911 Carrera, the Carrera script on the deck lid is Cheryl's work.
That's right.
Which is super cool, super cool. And the same with the Speedster font that followed at the end of the 80s.
Speedster and the Targa and the Carrera and Cabriolet.
Yes, yeah. So it is, because it is all that similar script.
Mm-hmm. And all those first four were all done together. Carrera, Turbo, Targa, and Cabriolet. Those four were done together, then Speedster was done right after that.
Okay, yeah. So were you tasked like specifically with coming up with like it's not so much a font as you said, it's just like how you've done it by hand. But
Yeah. And no, I was tasked with that. And it was for the Carrera was the initial task. And then my goal was, again, to make the consistency. So I took all of those, at that time, those four were kind of the things that were all on the cars at the time.
Yeah.
And so I worked on all those four logotypes together. And they were all done by hand.
That's
And
so-
it was all done by eye.
How did that work like in the 80s? So you've done this design. Does somebody just go, yep, looks good? Or, you know, how many like revisions were there? Like what was that kind of
Well,
process?
that whole process of those four scripts was 1 year's time.
Seriously,
So
yeah.
just put out, I don't know what the hours is to that.
Yeah.
And, you know, there used to be these because I worked in the studio. So, you know, I had a desk with paper and pens, and that's kind of it. There's no computers or anything. And I worked on them about 18 inches or so, or a little less.
Full size.
Yeah, so they're bigger than full size. Yeah, they were over full size. So they're about 18 inches. And I worked on all four of them. They would be all four. There would be a set of four. And they have these boards for doing full-size tape drawings of cars. And it was like you could put a side view and a front view. So how long were they? 10 feet? 12 feet?
Well, depending on the car.
15
yeah.
feet? Whatever.
Yeah,
They were a long board.
Yeah, it was a long board. So you had to have the side view, the front view, the rear view, and then the plan view, or half of the
So
top.
those boards are what? I don't know. And they
Yeah.
went up and down. So there's big walls that went up and down.
20 feet at
And,
least.
and so I was dedicated two of those walls I could just fill up. So I filled them up with writing that had been inked in and stuff. And they were 4 deep. They were the Turbo Targa Cabriolet. The Cabriolet was always on the top. And they were stacked. They were like a whole wall of just, yeah. And then it's like, okay, now how do we pick this out of this? Then we would narrow them down. And then it just kept getting narrowed down and then at some point they finally had to go on the car. And that's where everything changed, because the back of the 911 being at an angle changes the whole, how letters look thick or thin.
Yeah.
And and so the Carrera script, as celebrated as it is in this community, me as a typographer, I didn't celebrate it initially because I thought the A was not right. And I really felt very strongly about that, but when it got at that angle, it was like the correction of the A for that angle, so the thickness of the letters. And and I was very junior, so I couldn't put my foot down, and I was told those two areas are going to get thinner on that A, and that's it. It's like, okay, those things are, and so I wouldn't show it to my peers because it's like typographically it was wrong in my opinion. And so I wouldn't show it to anyone. It wasn't until I'd been not working for a long time I realized how celebrated it was. And but it's like, okay, well, so I did what I was told, and it's just interesting to me because then when other people have copied it I'm like, why didn't they fix it when they copied it?
Yeah, right. That's so
Propagate
funny.
a nice stick.
Yeah, it's so funny how you look at that like objectively, because again, like enthusiasts like Guy and I and the people behind the scenes, like, yeah, that is such like a iconic script, and that's not overclubbing it at all. It's, obviously Porsche kept it for the 964 that followed, right? So it must have been popular in-house as well.
Yeah, it was popular. And how it did come in at that same point when you asked how the development. So it was on paper, on hand.
Yeah.
And then it got to going on the car, and then I had a whole drawer of them cut out in vinyl, in thick vinyl, and then I cut out with an X-Acto knife and painted them black and stuck them on the car. That's how we did the evaluation. They were all like hand cut. So it's like went from hand drawn to hand cut. So, and that's how it was finally evaluated. And then they would, it's like, oh, we need a little small, a little bigger, because of the size and then the thickness. And
at the same time as you're doing that, Cheryl, right, are you like acutely aware that your work is going to be emblazoned on these sports cars and on people's drives and whatever for the next 50 years? The work will outlive like you, really. Are you aware of that, or is it just like another day at work?
It's another day at work.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's something that you learn obviously with age. I worked for a year at Landor, then I came to Porsche, and so I was very young. It's like, isn't this what everyone does at work? I don't know. It's like, yeah, it's like, but it was definitely made aware that, whatever you put on this car, that's going to be for life. It's like, it's not going to just get erased and change it out. So you're made aware of that. Yes, that was definitely, but I don't think it was ever stifling me like, oh my God, I can't do this because I might be wrong, so that was I think it's partially the confidence of the designer, that, it's like, yeah, this is how it should be. And two, it was, age, but it's also, then the other thing too, is that we did have a hierarchy. It wasn't just like me alone. So it was these the family, the Porsche family, that would definitely support you and say, yeah, that's the way to go. This is what we're going to do. We definitely always had that support, and I think we looked for that support in our gurus, that second level down that we had direct contact with all the time.
Yeah.
So, there wasn't, we worked in the studio, and you asked about the studio environment. It was divided at that time into 3 studios, and you sat right there with all the levels of design and the car in clay and the and the modelers working on it, and you're all in one big facility that you're talking and very interacting together all the time. So the support was definitely there.
That must be so inspiring to have that like direct feedback, like from the Porsche family, which I think, Ben, you've previously said to me the design department at the time when you guys there was about 30 people.
Oh, yeah.
There's hundreds now, right?
Yeah.
So just by numbers alone, the current employees wouldn't have as much of that direct interaction, I guess, with a family.
Well, I think philosophically, from the Porsche family, they were always a part of their products, their company. So they were integrated. They were hands-on with regards to the company. Although they brought in the new management, major members of the family, from Dr. Porsche, Louise Peak, the mother of Ferdinand Peak,
Yeah.
very involved with Porsche as well. And Ferdinand Peak himself too would show up every now and then Butzi Porsche and Wolfgang Porsche would show up, especially during major presentations, major presentations from a new car that was about to be introduced, or the color shows. They would be present, and they would be walked through the design department, have an early greeting, and then walk out to the yard to view all the products on display.
Yeah.
And then they would hold court over the presentation of the engineering, the technicals of the car, and then finally to the visuals of the car.
Yeah.
And then when there was more cars to be presented, they went from presenting the cars in the design viewing yard, where they have a turntable. They moved it out to the racetrack on the skid pad, because as the models grew, they needed just more space for all the cars.
The viewing platform, you said, like with the turntable, I think like viewers might recognise press shots. It's got it's like rocks, like
Right.
rocky backdrop, isn't it? Yes, I think.
Because the studio was at the bottom floor of WISAC, WISAC's Research and Development Center, and then that rock wall was to keep everything below, so no one could photograph anything going on in the design
the
department.
Right, yeah.
It was very difficult back then. No drones,
Spying on what you guys are up to.
And they always had lookouts for guys with telephoto lenses out in the forest. Because back then the spy shot thing was a big thing. Car magazines would pay a lot of money for a little blurry thing of whatever was going to come out from the cars.
And nothing came out of our studio. It was like, so that's what nowadays people always ask. So do you have some photos from those days? It's like, no, we don't have anything. We have a few really bad Polaroids, and that's like kind of it. Or we've already seen the pictures, because when the press department would come in and take pictures, we've all seen those pictures. But there was nothing. It was these 3 studios that looked onto that Hof, and that was it. But and it was it was a tight knit group. We did a lot socially together as well, and there was a whole group of us that was hired about within about the kind of 5-year range. So and we all hit middle management. We all got Porsches, and then.
Did it help having Peter Schutz as like the CEO that was like himself an American, or was that it had no bearing on the culture within Porsche Germany at the time?
There probably was, because when the Porsche family decided they needed fresh blood as far as the management was concerned, they were taking as many of the family members out of management of the company and trying to introduce more professional or versed managers to run the company for them. So there was probably some influence of that. Plus the desire to grow the product lineup, to improve sales. And the only way to improve sales was through volume for the company to earn more money from their sales. Remember that back in those days, I think Porsche was producing less than 40,000 or 30,000 cars a year. And that was with the 928, the 924. And they wanted to, when Peter Schutz was brought in, they wanted to increase that substantially.
Well, and go to the sky as well. I think you were involved with the development or the design side with the Flugmotor project.
As well. We got brought into that, the paint jobs and the graphics, again, mostly the graphics.
Right,
for that.
So there's a really cool press picture of these red and white planes with the...
Out front, we just saw some recent pictures of when we were painting that. We were all sitting out having a picnic by this half-painted plane.
Because Porsche was experimenting with not just the Flugmotor, but they were also doing work with Harley Davidson to redo some engine work for Harley Davidson at the time.
Some of Tony Hatter's design he showed us was forklift trucks and
Yep.
with it.
Yeah.
Yes,
Linde.
that's it. Yes, I'm
Linde,
glad you
yeah.
could pronounce that because I didn't say it because I didn't know how to pronounce it. So yeah,
The Airbus.
The Airbus.
The Airbus, we did the Airbus cockpit.
the cockpit. Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
the
I have
Airbus
seen some
cockpit.
press
And
pictures of
I
that.
also remember going in a Panzer.
Oh, the tanks. Yeah, that's true. We
yeah.
ended up designing
Yeah.
steering wheels for the tanks.
Wow,
I had to
yeah.
do the
Yeah.
graphics on it. And I remember,
Graphics and
'cause
the
it was-
ergonomics on them.
Yeah, so I had to go inside the tank to.
That's it's a fun day out, I guess. Yeah. With
The Leopard tanks, right?
Yeah, I don't
Leopard.
remember which one it was. Yeah.
I'll bring it back to sports cars. So again, like Ben, you and I in the past have spoken about this kind of perpetual fight, really, perennial fight for designers, whereby you've got to get the right balance at Porsche between tradition and innovation. And getting that right is a very kind of difficult line to tread with sports cars. From an exterior design, you mentioned it in our video before, but like Cheryl, from your role, did you find that principle was still prevalent, or did you find that you had a bit more creativity?
No, I think that principle still prevailed.
Yeah.
That there was, I mean, it's a very traditional product, so it has a long lineage that had to be followed. So I think we all were very respectful of that.
Yeah.
You know, it's like that you're not going to go off the deep end.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's as it still should be. You
Yeah.
know, it's.
I think they were always after consistency. You know, that consistency of the product always has to be maintained. And I think of all the car companies in the world, Porsche's is very clear.
Mm-hmm.
The lineage of the design from the 356 Speedster to the current cars that you have outside, you can still see hints of the 356 onto the new cars. No? Even the Panamera and
It's got a very passionate customer base, right?
yeah.
And you see,
Yeah.
look, every time something changes, there's uproar. Some people love it. Some people.
we're always having
People have
aren't we?
always got something to say.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I guess you're trying to keep
Right.
most people on the side.
And back in those days, the people who were so in love with the 911, they refused to buy 944s or 928s. There was that snobbishness about them. They would consider them, that's not a real Porsche.
It exists a bit today, even still, doesn't it?
Still, there's still people who do it.
Yeah,
they-
definitely. Yeah, with like
yes.
Boxsters and whatnot. You know, some
Right.
people won't look at it. I mean, like we're like the greatest fans of them at Nineworks. You know, we just think they're a fantastic, like resolved sports car. But there is definitely amongst
still
some
that reservation,
elements.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Like I guess Porsche's always had the 911. That's like everything hangs off of that from a
Right.
design point of view, and the whole philosophy and DNA of the company these days, I think, kind of resonates around that.
Yeah.
But Ben, with the exterior, I guess, of, you mentioned like the 928, there was the 959 and the 964, that kind of homogeny between all of those cars from a design point of view. Did that make the styling of those cars harder or easier in the period?
Well, when the 928 S4 was the very first project that I worked on, when that got developed and it got approved, that became the signature design language for all the cars that followed it, from the 944 Turbo to the 959 and then eventually to the 964. And then it went on to the 993s. The softness of that front end. That was actually what inspired me to go that direction, considering at the time, the wedge design form language was very popular for car designs at that time. But for me, the 356 was the quintessential or the original Porsche. So that voluptuous, look that the 356 had, I had to maintain somehow and bring to the 928. The 944 Turbo, despite the fact that they were quite edgy and had very tight little radiuses. I wanted to just soften them up as much as I could without losing the balance to the rest of the car. And that's where the challenge was, finding that right balance of that homogeneity and softness of the form language on the cars. That was the bigger challenge.
Yeah.
And that was done through endless modeling, the surfacing that the clay modelers did on the car, and then of course the management would, just keep pushing it. They say, no, if it needs more time, we will put the time into it until it just looks right.
Okay, yeah. And again, where the company's smaller back in the day, I guess it allowed a little bit more like wiggle room. So you need a bit more time for that. Yeah.
And you have to remember, back then it took so long to develop tools and parts.
Yeah.
So they needed to get it right from the get-go, rather than rely on just, okay, we'll just change the facelift 2 years down the road, like some companies do. Or some companies do that, actually.
Yeah.
A lot of that had to do too with the form development that Wolfgang Mobius introduced on the 928. The way he treated surface development was always based on how light hits that surface. That was very important. And that same principle was applied throughout all the Porsche cars. So every time the sculptors would interpret a designer's ideas, they would bring in we actually used fluorescent lights at the time to reflect onto the cars to see how the light would reflect on the surfaces. And
that were lined up.
They were lined up
Okay,
in rows, so you could literally see that on this reflective film that was applied to the clay model, and that would be what judged how much softness a fender would get. They would micromanage how the reflections would literally squiggle through a form. And that's why on most Porsche cars you will see this intersection between compound forms. It almost creates like an S-like reflection on the surfaces. No?
So were you still governed by crash protection and pedestrian safety like now?
Of
you
course,
see a lot of really ugly cars, or unbalanced, and they say, it's because it needs to be safe. So
Yes.
how much did that influence your design back then?
Well, you're given certain math parameters that the engineers say, okay, we can guarantee that there will be minimal damage if we retain certain distances from the sheet metal parts. And those were like the parameters we had to work around to get it right. So there was that on top of not just being creative artists. You had to take that piece of creativity that you created, but it's got to be engineered to pass the safety test.
Yeah.
The 928 is a perfect example of that. That soft front end back then was made with rim urethane, if I'm not mistaken. That material that would crumple, and then there was a certain amount of styrofoam hidden behind that to create that 5 mile an hour impact, and it would return to its original form without damaging anything in the sheet metal.
Yeah.
Stuff like that we had to.
Can we talk about 959? So,
Sure.
where do we start with it, right? So, it's a car that still defines a lot of like what Porsche stands for today, as far as I'm concerned and can see, and a lot of technology that's on the current 992, you can trace its roots back to that car. Its challenges, if you like, when it was kind of in testing and development are kind of well documented. Did that ever kind of pull through to you guys as staff working on it? Like, was it a headache at the time?
No, because it was such an exciting project.
Yeah.
It came out first as the Group B, the show car. That was the impetus for the 959. But the assignment was just so exciting that everybody just couldn't wait to get their hands on it. No?
And it was in the studio for a very short time.
Yeah.
And which is also, like you talked about, is it just another day of the job? When that project came in, it wasn't another day of the job. We all knew, and we worked really long hours.
Yeah.
Too.
Oh. Yeah, like 60, 70 hours,
Yeah. Which is
weekends,
really,
which was...
in Germany, not heard of.
Yeah, because Germany, they had very strict labor, laws that you had to comply with. Nobody works over 40 hours.
And we had to leave 10 hours in between. So,
Right.
so
We'd have
because
to
again,
clock out.
we were like a young staff, and so we would like to stay there and work on it late. We'd work on it late. And we would clock out, but then we couldn't clock in the morning because our 10 hours hadn't passed, so we would have to wait
Yeah.
and clock in at noon or whatever, So,
Wow.
It was definitely that was a very fun time in the studio.
Yeah, the fact that it was developed for Group B racing, was the assignment, you know, and then for Le Mans, of course. No? So the design brief for it had to incorporate, it's got to be 200-mile-an-hour car, you know. So the aerodynamics was very tantamount to everything we did. It was all about how aerodynamic can we make this car while making it look good. And then the technology that they were going to introduce to it, you know, with the adjustable suspension.
Yeah, basically active aerodynamics there.
Active
as well.
aerodynamics,
Yeah.
right. And then the twin turbos, you know, because they require a lot of air to be sucked in to produce that much horsepower without literally water cooling the engine. No?
Yeah.
So there was a lot. There was a lot of very challenging parameters, but we found ways around them.
And the other thing about it was everything was being worked on at the same time. Like the interior was being developed as the exterior was being developed, as the brochure was being developed.
Yeah.
I mean, I was working on the brochure for that when the engine hadn't, it's like, well, how does this go here? Like, what's going to go on here?
Right,
You know,
yeah.
it's like, you know, we were asking these questions, like, you know, that we didn't even know what the answer was.
The width of the car, too, you know, was dictating a lot of things, because of the wider tires and the fact that it would be set up for Group B homologation at the time. That was a big challenge because it was considerably wider than a normal turbo, too. And then the wing in the back, you know, we didn't want a super high wing because it would ruin the silhouette of the car. Because remember the 935, the Moby Dick 935, had a very high wing.
Yeah.
We wanted to get the same amount of downforce, but also reduce the lift. And so we managed to do that with that lower tail, you know, that slot in the back for the rear wing.
Yeah.
Wind tunnel testing started almost immediately. We weren't even finished with the design, and we were already wind tunnel testing to see how that could work. No?
Yeah.
All the holes, the wheel lips, you know, the shaping of them, the fact that they're rounded, that was all because of aerodynamics. No?
I was going to ask it, like with that like rear wing, it's like lovely, as you said, like curvaceous profile, but then like underneath that you've got that, it's a detail that's often missed, that like rubber lip running across like the trailing edge of the car. Like, how significant is that, and you know, at what point was that added, really?
For, the results of the wind tunnel tests
Yeah.
dictated that we needed a higher tear-off point. You know, imagine the airflow going over the fenders and into that cavity where the spoiler is. You know,
Yeah.
so the tear-off for the air that was being channeled through that needed an additional, a little bit more height.
Yeah.
So we saw it in the museum, didn't we, last year, the one with all the handwriting on it.
Oh yes, yeah,
Remember?
yeah, yeah. It's
I
probably
think they
like
had a
these guys'
production run.
handwriting, to be
Probably
fair.
probably your handwriting.
Yeah.
It was all like little narrations all over the car, just unbelievable.
Yeah, quite probably is your work, to be fair. Yeah, yeah. And how early on in the design process did the rain gutters get ditched on the 959?
Very early.
Yeah.
Very early. There were those, not just from design, but also for aerodynamics.
Yeah,
no?
yeah.
Same thing with the mirrors. You know, we went from the ping pong paddles to the more
To the Dimson mirrors.
to the the more triangular shape, no?
Yeah.
Because of how much resistance the original ones had. So the target for the 959 was 200 plus miles an hour. The biggest challenge it had was actually the tires, because no tires, street tires, were developed for a car that could go that fast.
That was like the Jag XJ220 as well,
Yeah,
I think.
back in
Same
the
thing,
day,
yeah.
Couldn't do the tyres.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they were also run
The
flats,
tyres
weren't they?
were
Like, yeah. I hope you don't mind, Ben, sharing a couple of years ago an email exchange we had. So I borrowed a friend's 959 and drove it back on the Autobahn. Incredible day, right? Incredible day. And I thought of you while driving this car, like, and knowing particularly your input, and obviously Cheryl later learning like your input on it. So I thought I will shoot you an email and just say I've had this fantastic day driving this 959 on the Autobahn, you know, like it's home. Managed to get up to 175 mile an hour, and your response was fantastic because you said, I'm glad you enjoyed it. However, we designed the car to be a 200 mile an hour car, so you're actually 25 mile an hour short. So
You got a bit more
to
go.
You win some, you win some, you lose some, right? But like, even like looking at the on the interior shell with like, you know, the iconic 5 dials that the 959 had, influenced by the 911, there was a lot more. There's a lot more to display in there, and there's a lot more influence. Like, did you work on that side of things?
Yeah, I did some. Yeah, it's like, you know, I don't recall exactly what it was, but yes, if at that time it involved dials and working with video and how we were going to develop. I believe at that time it was some of the very first rear lit, but I don't know that it ever made it into the car. I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think that ended up in the car, but that's what we were kind of working
Well,
on.
I remember the graphics for the suspension.
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
all on
oh,
the
yeah.
instrument.
Yeah, that did, yeah. And I developed those little springs.
Yeah,
The
right,
little
yeah.
springs, and then you know how the car sits, or you know.
The graphic of like the damper that's on the 959 is essentially like that form pretty much is still used today. So is that like your
Yeah.
pen as well,
Yeah,
pen work?
so.
That's incredible. So much like to learn here. So look, we got a 964 behind us. Like for you guys, like looking at that today, how does that make you feel?
Well, it's amazing it's still around, you know. When we were designing the car, I never imagined that it would get to, you know, this much of a following, that the 964 actually, at the time it was being developed, I had reservations about the overall design of the car because I wanted more changes to it. For me, one of the biggest things about the 911 that bothered me as a designer was the front fender and the widow's peak. I always wanted to, you know, rake the pillars a little bit further back and then drop that lead-in because it's so, that's probably why it's called the widow's peak. No? And aerodynamically, you know, if it was brought down a bit and rounded off a bit more, it would help the overall performance of the car. And then the front fenders, because it is the 911, and you know, with my work on the 928 and the inspiration of the 356, I wanted to bring that front fender down just a bit more. But because at the time the technology for the headlights was actually a bigger hurdle at the time, you know, because for the kind of speeds that the cars could reach, Porsche insisted we have to have so much headlight projection capability, and you couldn't do that with a smaller headlight. No?
Yeah.
So those were the sorts of the, you know,
Also,
the excuses they used to tell me, no, you're not getting a fender, and you know.
and also designers are never happy. You know? That's
right.
part of our DNA. It was like, it could be a little bit better. You know? So.
Yeah, the biggest issue I had was trying to balance the volumes of the rear bumper with the front bumper, you know, and that's why I wanted the fenders to be part of that change. You know? Because when you look at the car in side view, the car still has a tendency to look like it's a bit of a tail dragger, you know, just visually when you look at the car. No? Some of the owners of 964s, they've tweaked the suspension somewhat so they sit right, no? By moving the wheels out, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know if they handle any better for that, but they definitely look better. No?
Yeah.
When you get the, you know, the right stance with the car. The front fender, because it's the non-turbo versions like this one, I always wanted the front fenders to be a bit more generous as far as the surface is concerned. You know, so that lip, for me, it's fairly frail in relation to the rear fender on the Carrera. You know, as a designer, you're always looking for balance. No, you're looking at the volumes, and you want to match, you know, the front with the rear as best as you can, in order to create a more homogeneous, you know, design overall. No?
Yeah.
Was the hydraulic sort of spoiler always factored in from the start?
Yes, yeah, because we wanted to move away from having a fixed spoiler. So that movable spoiler was an introduction as part of the technical package for the car to introduce, you know, this is going to be the first four-wheel drive Porsche that you could buy, and so the aerodynamics had to be improved, and nobody wanted a fixed spoiler on the street car, on the regular car. I mean, the turbo would have it, of course, but not the standard.
The car at the time, as we discussed previously, was announced as like the 911 for the next 25 years. The 993, production 993, was introduced like 4 years later. So at the time of like the design of the 964, did you know that the 993 would come up so soon, or were you thinking there would be a longevity to this that, say, like the G series cars enjoyed?
No, we didn't envision the 993. It was probably after I left, then they started, but when the 964 was developed, they figured, after so many models were built, they saw, there's ways we can improve upon this, because the car was pretty darn good. No?
Yeah.
When the suspension got changed, where the offset, I think it was negative camber, was introduced in the suspension. It changed the wheel design. Therefore, the Fuchs wheels, the typical Fuchs wheels, could no longer be used. And that's how we ended up with this. Or the trash lid.
The design
wheels,
D90s.
Right, yeah.
That's
right.
incredible, yeah, trash
That's
lid.
well, in German,
Yeah.
Mülleimer Deckel. That's back then.
So was that your tweak as well, Ben, with the mirrors? Because Cheryl, you alluded to it a couple of minutes ago. You said the Dimson mirrors. Was that the teardrop mirrors?
The more teardrop,
yes. Yeah. Which is
that was introduced with the 95, the Group B.
Yes.
The Group B show car.
Yeah, and latterly came onto these cars like for
because
later
there
years.
was very slight aerodynamic improvement in the car. So they moved from the ping pong
Flags
paddles, right? To
Yeah. What like to both of you guys like collectively feel about design in the modern day, particularly from a Porsche perspective?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
No, I
Ladies first.
I just think design in general is awesome. What's happening in all types of design, just because the world is so much more aware of design than like when we were working. When you would tell people you're a designer, they're just like, "What's that?" and like, "What do you do?" It's like I can't even like envision what you're doing. And now it's like it's so celebrated, and I think that's awesome. And I think it's great that designers, be it industrial or whatever kind of design, that people notice them, and it's an industry that's being very much celebrated. And as far as what Porsche is doing now, it's up to you to.
Yeah. Well, there's always your personal taste versus other people's tastes in cars, but in general, I think the current Porsches coming out, they've maintained that family heritage. I probably don't agree with a lot of the details that are a little bit more, rigid and square. I just feel that they're maybe a little too stiff for the softness of some of the cars, but I guess some of the customers are asking for, this crisper, slightly crisper look about the Porsches versus the super softness of the Porsches of the 80s and the 90s. No? And that's probably because it's being influenced by what's happening in the market. You have so many brands now and so many cars out there now that you have to increase the appeal somehow, and you do that by design. And as designers, you introduce things that are more acceptable or friendlier to the eye of the consumer, rather than forcing them to accept, your way or the highway. You put in elements of design that appeal to a greater public.
You're a global market, right?
Right.
Back in the day,
Right. Yeah.
probably quite niche.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas now you're probably every
Right.
country of the world, appealing to everything from like the EV
Right.
side, the Macans,
Yeah.
and at every price point, right? You've got the Caymans and the Boxers at the low end, and we're now up to £350,000 cars.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
And beyond, actually.
that'll be like what is interesting
Mission
is there's, and I'm sure you guys have seen this as well or noticed it, is that design homogeny is creeping back in, so that like Macans do look or have a similar frontal to a Taycan, and
the light
it
bar,
is,
the light bar at the back,
yeah, definitely. I've got two more questions just for the backroom team on it. So, Guy, I want to ask you a question on 964s. Like, no pressure. What with your company?
Right,
here.
so I'll do the fast version.
Yeah. How was it like to drive?
I enjoyed it. You know, I've had an SC for a few years. I'm now in an RS, which is obviously a completely different thing, PDK. But I've never driven one of these. I come out with a 915 gearbox on SC, and it felt very agricultural, a bit like one of my old Beetles,
Yes.
albeit a little bit quicker. But this actually, my first impression was the engine noise. Beautiful, lovely engine. The minute you start it up, gearbox was much more direct. I think it showed its age a little bit in a slightly, you know, spongy brakes, maybe a little bit, but you know, that's probably I'm blessed with what I'm driving at the moment. But I thought it was a very accomplished car. You know, I thought it's the sort of car you could live with if you had to have one. I thought it covered a lot of bases. You know, it was driving in London, 20 mile an hour limit. You know, I felt the clutch was decent. You know, it wasn't a hard car to drive. Size, loved it. Being back in a car where you can see the wings. You know, it's a lovely place to be. You know, I think they deserve their value and the appeal that people are still fluffing. They're going up and up. You know, this is an £82,000 car, which is nuts. You know, these cars, what did they go down to? 15s.
Yeah. Like quite literally, you know, just over 10 years ago, that's what they were like valued at the UK. The rise monetarily has been unbelievable, really. It's certainly unprecedented. I think a great achievement of the 964 as well. It was the first 911 where, as an owner, you could work out the heater system and how to use it. Because the G-body before, I mean, I bet you never got to grips with yours. Like,
it was useless.
Nobody, I think, to this day knows how to use them. I guess. Fantastic. Thanks, that guy. To finish, Ben and Cheryl, and we've really scratched the surface from your careers. But it would be great to know, like, what are you most proud of from like your time at Porsche?
Well, it is this era, you know, of cars that at the time you just don't realize how good they're going to be. You know, so you're just doing your job as best as you can, and you know, the reactions that I get nowadays. You can't help but, you know, feel proud, a lot of pride for, you know, things that you did back then that, you know, in the day you weren't taking that seriously. You know, it was just another job, and it just turned out great for Porsche in the end. You know, that consistency through the car lines. They've maintained it, and you know, you can still see a lot of it evolving into the new cars, and that's a tremendous satisfaction on my part.
Excellent. Yeah, and Cheryl?
Well, I'm really glad that the heater system, you could figure that out, because I do remember working on that. And when you mentioned it, I was like, shit, you worked on that for a long time. You know? So it's like, that's good news.
I think a lot of people have got,
One thing I've got to ask before I forget. So on the 992.2, the start button, right? I looked at it, and I just looked at the fonts, and I'm sure they're all different, but you're a professional, so are they different? Because when you look at it...
Right.
Start button, I wasn't there. We still use keys.
It shows.
But probably the crest is one of my... It's the jewel, right? It's the little jewel that I know is not going to change for a long time.
Yeah.
So, and it's also something that probably you guys didn't notice it, so not a lot of people notice it. But I know it, and that's important to me.
Well, I mean, hopefully everybody watching and listening
now they're going to know.
Hear that as well. So, look, thank you so much. You've not long stepped off a plane back here in Europe, so to jump in front of the lights, it really is fantastic, and have Guy and I put some questions to you. So, you know, thank you for your contributions to the lives of so many, like, thousands of enthusiasts around the world as well. Like, your work has made a tangible difference to a lot of people. So congratulations on that. I want to say thanks to James and the team here at Tower Bridge Studios for editing this together, giving us the facility and shooting so professionally. You've made us look amazing and far beyond what our usual remit. Guy, as a fellow DNHC Driven Not Hidden Collective member, thank you for your efforts, mate, and bringing the car along, picking it up from Ashgood today as well. So
Yes.
lots of good stuff. Thank you very much for tuning in and watching 9works TV and listening via 9works Radio. Hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.